Good morning. My name is John McMahon, and I'll be the moderator for this august Blue Ribbon panel we have assembled here today. You really have a running start as to the proceedings for the rest of the day with the movie and then with the timely presentation of Director Deutsch. All the panel members feel that he activated some of the Watergate veterans, and they came into our hotel rooms and stole all our speeches. But I think that there is merit in repetition, and today you really are part of a novel approach in the United States, and I think it's very much a forerunner of things to come, and most appropriate for the free society that we enjoy and cherish. The truth in advertising laws insists that I point out to you that I did not develop the U2 and Corona. I think the closest thing I came to it was standing in awe and watching it as it happened, and I really didn't become active until after the U2 flew and after Corona was well on its way. I wanted to be able to say that I appeared after those first 12 failures and everything worked, but that's not the case. But it was a marvelous experience for anyone, and we have some of the forefathers of that program here and on the panels. So you are certainly amidst the pathfinders for our space reconnaissance programs. In fact, if you wind your clocks back 37 years and try to think of what space was all about, you really find it's very hard to do. You've become too sophisticated. But at that point in time, we had no experience in space, and to think of orbiting the Earth was beyond the comprehension of the average person. And today we take it for granted. We get our weather forecast from space. We talk to our friends and business associates over communication, satellite, telephone links. Space in general, whether it's by NASA or commercial programs or the military, is just part of our everyday life. And there it is. In fact, we find that seldom do we keep track of shuttle launches, and many do not even bother to turn on their TV sets when a launch happens. With that as a backdrop, as you sit here today, it's difficult to relive the daring of the Corona program. Think of the courage that a handful of government officials, military and civilian, had to propose and to seek approval and finally carry out our first venture into space. Could we orbit a satellite? Could it take meaningful pictures from space? And could we really bring it back in a film recovery capsule? All of these were very profound questions that required accomplishments, the first of the kind in the annals of the United States. And as the day unfolds, you will witness the bold and courageous efforts by contractors to do what no man or woman had done before. And you will share the anxiety of the government officials who had the vision to persevere in spite of the many setbacks and failures. Only the stoutest hearts could have prevailed. You followed the technical evolution of the Corona system from 40-foot resolution on the first flight to 5 feet, from one entry vehicle to 2, and of course from mono to stereoscopic photo coverage. Why did so much effort and risk go into the first satellite effort? Just stop and think of the times. Remember that our lack of knowledge of the Soviet Union prompted President Eisenhower to proceed with the extraordinary program of the U-2 overflights, while recognizing that it would only be a year or two before the Soviets would counter those flights. So he pressed for alternatives, and they took the form of the A-12, now known as the SR-71 reconnaissance aircraft, and the thoughts of satellite photography being explored under an Air Force program known as the WS-117L. The crying need to understand what was happening in the Soviet Union drove the program and gave tolerance to the risk. There was indeed general concern in this country that there was a missile gap, and overall we were falling behind the Soviets in our military posture. Our national security was indeed at stake. Also bear in mind that President Eisenhower advocated open skies in 1955, and when Khrushchev turned down the president, could only conclude that the Soviets wanted to conduct their actions in a closed society and in secret from the world. What also added stimulus to the Corona effort was the proclamation by the Soviets that they fired an ICBM in August 1957. And of course, as you recall, the Sputnik satellite was orbited in October of the same year. And so the Corona program moved forward, at first thought of as an interim solution to our nation's reconnaissance effort. But it proceeded with great haste. With presidential approval in April 1958, noted on the back of an envelope by the DDCI at the time, General Cabell, and the seamless government industry team, which would not be deterred, Corona came to fruition. In the span of a little over a decade, it produced 145 launches at a cost of $850 million and returned 3 million nautical miles square of cloud-free photography, revealing all of the Soviet missile complexes, medium, intermediate, and long range, each class of submarines, a complete inventory of bombers and fighters, the Soviet ABM effort, their weapons storage, and maps for our strategic forces targeting. More importantly, it gave our policymakers the confidence to enter into disarmament talks and to fashion the SALT I Treaty. A remarkable program. What's even more remarkable for you advocates of acquisition reform, Director Deutsch spoke of the mission being espoused in 3 short paragraphs. The work statement was a page and a half. And what was more important about it, when Dan Kelly and George Becerra came back from a meeting, they went to Jim McDonnell here and said, "Jim, we want you to write a work statement." And he said, "Fine, what do you want me to say?" And they said, "We can't tell you." I wish we had more Jim McDonnells around today for those page and a half work statements. Let me introduce my panel all at once to save time of jumping up and down later on. We have General Lew Allen, who served in the Air Force space programs for 7 years. And his last assignment in that particular role was as director of the Air Force space programs. He then moved on to be director of the National Security Agency. He was commander of the Air Force Systems Command, and finally obtained the highest job in the United States Air Force, that is Chief of Staff. It was at his initiative, as you noted earlier on in the program, that the movie A Point in Time was made. And the Corona program that you will see in the Smithsonian later on was preserved for this day. After retiring from the Air Force, General Allen worked for the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and he is now chairman of the board of the Draper Laboratories and a member of the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, and from that also serves on the Aspen Committee looking at the whole structure of the intelligence community and what the intelligence community of the future ought to look like. We have Dr. Richard Garwin, member of the President's Science Advisory Committee and the Defense Science Board. And Dick has had a long history of advising presidents and has played key roles not only through his defense or through his advisory commission as an advisor to the president, but he will share with you some of the early on Corona decision-making processes in his role there. He's had a distinguished career with the IBM Corporation, has made contributions involving design of nuclear weapon systems. He's been and he has worked right now currently as an IBM Fellow Emeritus at the Thomas J. Watson Research Center in New York. He's an adjunct research fellow in the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, as well as an adjunct professor of physics at Columbia University. We will then hear from Jim Plummer, was Lockheed's manager responsible for the development of Lockheed's aspect of the Corona program, and he succeeded in moving up through the highest levels of the Lockheed Missile and Space Company. He served as Undersecretary of the Air Force and as Director of the National Reconnaissance Program, and also had the unique assignment as the Secretary of the Air Force for some 7 months. Following his retirement from government service, Jim returned to Lockheed as Executive Vice President. He's now retired and lives in Bend, Oregon. And finally, we have Dr. Walt Levison from the ITEC Corporation. He was the original ITEC program manager on Corona, and he's responsible at that time for all of ITEC's aerial reconnaissance business. Before joining ITEC, Mr. Levison was Assistant Director of the Boston University Physical Research Laboratories, in charge of the development of specialized reconnaissance programs for the Air Force. Walt retired from ITEC in 1974 as Senior Vice President of Operations and continues to give his valued judgment to not only ITEC but to Lockheed and Mark Systems and another of major companies around. That, ladies and gentlemen, is our panel, and I would like now to introduce Dr. Lou Allen.
Thank you, John. I'll just speak from here. Fine. We can go back even a little bit further and remember that von Karman in 1945 wrote a report called Toward New Horizons, which was very influential in setting the tone of the Air Force research and development program in the succeeding 50 years. In that document, he observed that if you had the propulsion for a long-range ballistic missile, you were very close to having the propulsion to place something in orbit. But there were no speculations in that report as to why one would want to do that. As you will recall, RAND kind of got started by a very prescient early document which observed that there were uses for satellites in orbit and that reconnaissance was certainly a key one of those. As RAND then was formed and those studies were continued, that whole concept was expanded and fleshed out a great deal to where by 1953 there was a substantial body of study by RAND observing the various things that could be done in space, and this volume, because of the sensitivity of the reconnaissance mission, was classified top secret. Around 1954 and 55, at Wright Field, there was a project office established under Bill King, which went around the country and briefed the RAND report and suggested that the Air Force should begin to move in an area to implement some of the things that RAND had observed were possible. Bill recalls that he did not always receive a warm reception, that many people were very skeptical of these space concepts, and Bill says he used to carry a dishpan around in which he'd spin a ball bearing to try to indicate how forces worked on keeping an object in orbit, because people didn't really believe it would work at all. SAC, for example, was very uninterested, and LeMay basically kicked him out. And they were conscious that even then there were some political protests about the studies they were doing, saying that overflying by space is not really very desirable. By 56, these studies did lead to the establishment of WS-117L, but without any significant amount of money attached to it, perhaps some money for studies. It was transferred somewhere around then to the West Coast, largely because as the project was established, Benny Schriever and Cy Ramo observed that whatever its merits, it was very likely to mess up the ICBM, IRBM programs that they were conducting on the West Coast unless they had control. So they wanted it moved out there and integrated in some fashion with the missile development programs themselves. That turned out to be an obviously good decision as time went on. In 57, of course, Sputnik flew. And after that, people began to take space seriously, and the dollars began to flow, and 117L actually began to get funded. The Air Force interest grew greatly. I can recall that shortly before Sputnik, we were all encouraged to not use the word space in any documents. And immediately after Sputnik, we were encouraged to use the word space in all documents. SAC began to believe that it was really possible to have objects in orbit, and they began to recognize that reconnaissance from space was extraordinarily important to them for target planning. So they began to really give it support. But by the end of 57, it was clear to most people, I presume even the 117L people on the West Coast, that the schedules were unrealistic. 117L was trying to address a broad menu of requirements, bringing along both the Atlas programs and the Thor programs, and for several different purposes. And it lacked a focus, and it lacked a real urgency to get an interim capability. And that's in the latter part of 57 and early part of 58 is when the decision-making process clearly moved to Washington. And the DCI and the President and as Dick Garwin I'm sure will say, the President's advisors, all were involved in saying that one had to significantly change the approach in order to adequately meet the demands of the nation. And so when those decisions were made and one decided to pursue Corona as a covert program, the Air Force people that were involved and witting, some were involved but not witting and were a little upset at how things were proceeding, but the ones who were involved and witting as to what was going on recognized that the political sensitivity of overflight made it very likely that a covert program was the only way to really be successful. And therefore there was, I think, enthusiasm on the parts of the witting people involved to really make this thing work. When the Thor part of 117L was canceled, which was a month or two later, when it was clear that the cover story was breaking down a little bit, there was some fuss, but mostly by the unwitting folk. And I think the Air Force CIA team was pulling together extremely well. ARPA was nominally in charge, but was largely a pass-through organization, and the activity was done in key measure by the program officer Richard Bissell at CIA and his deputy Ozzie Ritland on the West Coast. Projects seem to work well when there is a very clear mission and a clear understanding of that mission. And that was the case here. There was no ambiguity throughout the life of Corona that it was aimed at national intelligence, and that the need for that national intelligence was very great to Air Force mission people as well as to to national planners for other bases than the strategic programs. It was also very clear to people that the program needed to remain covert. The risk of physical interference, but primarily political objection to overflight was high in the minds of everyone, and the covert nature of the program was felt to be extremely important and therefore assiduously observed by the people that were involved. The initial cooperation between all parties was remarkable. As you saw in the film, the delineation of responsibilities between the Air Force and CIA was not all that clear. Very fuzzy, apparently, even to Bissell and Ritland, and was worked out primarily by the people on the spot on the West Coast. Lee Battle as the program director, Charlie Murphy up in the helicopter facility in Palo Alto as the Air Force people making this thing play together, did an extraordinary job in pulling it all together without squabbles. There were, of course, squabbles later on. I mean, it's hard for porcupines to mate without there being a few sticky points. But those squabbles were handled over the life of the program in a quite satisfactory manner. The Air Force responsibilities, of course, included the establishment of Vandenberg as the launch base for the missiles and the rockets, the establishment of a tracking and control network, the establishment of the recovery squadron and developing the skills to catch the parachutes in midair. As a friend of mine who was responsible for that during part of the program often said that if you'd come to him and describe this ridiculous notion of catching parachutes in midair as a way to get things back from space, you'd laughed out of the room, except for the fact that by then it had been done. These were all very challenging things, all brand new for everyone involved, and it took an enormous amount of dedication and innovation to bring them all off together. As one looked back on the program, it of course is remarkable that the determination of people to persist through a long series of failures occurred. Today, you can't imagine that one would do that. What you can imagine is that one would have had a failure and stopped and studied the causes of the failure for about a year and put in fixes that would have taken 6 months or so and then flown again. The net result of that might have been less failures, but the amount of time and money would have expanded tremendously. Although, as you probably noticed, that's a lot of failures to occur. The amount of time in which all that was occurring was very short. So the amount of time between starting this program and having success was really very, very short. And certainly by today's standards of challenging programs, it was short indeed in spite of all the failures. I think it's a remarkable story, one in which John Deutsch said properly, there are many lessons to be learned. It's not so easy to apply those lessons today, but nevertheless the lessons are there, and it behooves us all to learn as much as we can from them for our activities in the future. But it was a program of remarkable accomplishment, remarkable cooperation between the Air Force and the CIA, and tremendous success. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll save all the questions to the end, and then you can address them to the panel at large. Dick Garwin.
I'm going to give a view from a longtime member of the Land panel. Edwin H. Land, inventor of polarizing film and the Polaroid instant film process and camera, was president of the Polaroid Company. He was an extremely ingenious, productive, and forceful person. He was a genius and a showman. In March 1954, President Eisenhower challenged the Science Advisory Committee of the Office of Defense Mobilization to use new technologies to counter the Soviet potential of nuclear attack on the U.S. by intercontinental bomber. Land became chairman of Project 3, Intelligence Capabilities, of the Technological Capabilities Panel, TCP, the activity organized in July of 1954 by James Killian to respond to Eisenhower's challenge. Projects 1 and 2 dealt with continental defense and striking power. Land did not want to be part of a panel activity with more members than could meet in a taxi cab, and I suppose the 6-member TCP Project 3 would have held all its meetings in taxis if it had not been for the highly classified nature of the activities. By 1954, November of that year, President Eisenhower approved the TCP Project 3 proposal to build the U-2, the jet engine sailplane camera system that you saw for long-range strategic reconnaissance from high altitude, and the responsibility for its development and operation were assigned to CIA, all to be covert and subject to special security procedures. This high-resolution, small-format camera constituted a new optimization of aerial photography that would allow the capture of enormous areas on film. In this activity, relevant to overhead imagery, Land and Edward M. Purcell, physicist of Harvard University, and James G. Baker, inventor and designer par excellence of high-performance optics, were among the Land Panel members in its later incarnations. Although even the first flight of the U-2 over the Soviet Union on July 4, 1956 was unexpectedly tracked by Soviet radar, it continued to fly repeated missions until shot down May 1, 1960. Richard Bissell, CIA director of the U-2 CIA Air Force project, in early 1955 asked Din Land and his TCP intelligence panel to advise him on systems for technical collection of intelligence, which included the U-2 and then later the Oxcart program that would produce the Mach 3 reconnaissance aircraft, the A-12, and then the two-seat SR-71. In the film, you heard Bissell recount how he later received the information from Land that Bissell was to develop the Corona system. This was not marching orders, more like a marching suggestion, I guess. Din Land's intelligence panel continued its activities and constituted an important part of the nation's strategic reconnaissance program. It was involved then in the continuous improvement of Corona, as well as successor satellite systems which improved substantially on Corona performance. I was pleased to be able to join the Land panel by 1962, or maybe somewhat earlier. I don't recall. Most of the recommendations of the Land panel involved the National Reconnaissance Office, the NRO, for which the two chief implementing elements belonged to CIA and Air Force. In addition, however, there were non-NRO recommendations dealing with research and development, and especially R&D that was not specific to a particular satellite system, but that would be of general use in improving the capability of any system. For instance, improved image storage capability, photographic interpretation techniques, dissemination of imagery, and other intelligence data, and the like are non-system specific. During my years with the Land panel, we met typically several times a year for 2 or 3 successive days, either in Washington or in the field. In either location, we would hear from government sponsors as to the recent performance of systems in operation, look at the status of the development of new systems, and hear proposals for systems still more advanced. We shared in much of the anguish that accompanied these programs in their early days, and also in some of the joy of success. Occasionally, we would meet at a contractor facility and sometimes in the magnificent boardroom at Polaroid, where Din Land's cook might provide us with dinner, although, as I recall, sometimes at 11 p.m. Once our Land panel meeting did not adjourn until dawn. That was unusual, but it was not unusual to work until midnight and then to be invited to Din Land's personal laboratory for a half-hour demonstration of his latest work on color vision. The Land panel would sometimes meet in room 206, 208 of the old executive office building next to the White House, where we review programs, proposals, and look at some of the most recent images. Din Land inspired us and kept us on track. Our job was not primarily to invent solutions, because there were usually plenty of those to exhaust the budget and the development resources. Rather, our task was as quickly and surely as possible to separate the wheat from the chaff and to encourage the wheat. We tried hard to increase the portion of intelligence community research and development effort in non-system specific areas, and occasionally, in addition to helping to choose among system or technology options, we did contribute a valuable technical innovation. Often the recommendations of the President's Science Advisory Committee or of the Land panel were less important than the free, informed, and open discussion among those involved in this highly secret field that led those present, contractors and government personnel alike, to a better understanding of the options and their implications. In this regard, I followed the same principle I've always applied in my involvement with government, to help as much as I could to improve each option, but then to help to make the necessary choices among them. You cannot go to market with all of the technologies that you could develop. The LAND panel worked often at a very technical level, and some of these technical considerations had major impact. For instance, during the mid-1960s, with Donald F. Hornig as President's Science Advisor, the LAND panel undertook a study of the potential performance and utility of the Manned Orbiting Laboratory program for strategic reconnaissance, which was the primary, although classified, goal of the program. We arrived at a very definite conclusion that humans in space had no beneficial and a lot of harmful effects on strategic reconnaissance. And this report, presented by Don Hornig to Secretary of Defense Robert F. McNamara, was instrumental in the demise of the Manned Orbiting Laboratory program. In a draft of a LAND panel report on March 1st, 1965, I tried to reflect the panel's philosophy. The panel is very much disturbed that continuing low-level research is not performed at the necessary scale in this field. Conservatism is certainly a virtue in the later stages of development of an operational system, but if it is to be practiced there, then there must be a venturesome exploratory development and advanced development program and a short feedback cycle to address problems that appear during the development phase. And the previous frame on my microfiche film was that the full fare on the Eastern Air Shuttle from New York to Boston was $16 30 years ago. These strategic reconnaissance programs were among the blackest of the black programs, often characterized as wasteful and inefficient, if not worse. But this was not so for most of them, in my experience. I was extremely pleased with the quality of the technical program leadership and their willingness to listen to advice and criticism from the outside and to do something about it. In his memoirs, President Eisenhower did not mention satellite technical reconnaissance innovation, for which he deserves a lot of credit beyond the publicly known U-2 program of the time. Many of our satellites still require the protection of secrecy, but secrecy is not enough. Soviet rejection of Eisenhower's Open Skies proposal of July 1955 was followed by the initiation of the covert U-2 flights and by the satellite reconnaissance program. Despite Soviet diplomatic protests of U-2 overflights, it was the Soviet Union that initiated satellite overflight with the launch October 4th, 1957 of the first Sputnik. And that must have been some relief for those who feared eventual Soviet destruction of U.S. satellites. As I testified November 9th, 1991, in a celebration of the contributions of Edwin H. Land to public policy and national security, and hoping to advance his views, I said, I believe it would be foolish, no, it would be tragic, to follow the siren song urging that we put actual weapons into space, or that we must be ready to destroy photographic satellites launched by some nation not friendly to our cause. We depend heavily on our own satellites to gather vital information, and it is far easier to destroy a satellite than to build another highly capable one. Sadly, a satellite eye for a satellite eye would be no consolation for us and little deterrent for an opponent. We can hardly organize the wrath of nations against a power using an anti-satellite weapon, an ASAT against one of our satellites, while maintaining that our own use of anti-satellite weapons against other satellites would be legitimate. Our course should be that of conviction and leadership toward the early conclusion of a universal treaty banning satellite destruction or tests of such satellite systems, and also a ban on weapons in space. Well, to wrap up, so collegial in many cases were our activities that it may not be meaningful to ask who originated an idea, who recast it, who polished it so that it might be persuasive and implemented. I think we shared the view of Jerry Wiesner, which I heard from him in 1953, that one could either accomplish something or get credit for it, but not both. But tough choices had to be made, as with the cancellation of the Manned Orbiting Laboratory, and Din Land and his panel did not shrink from its obligation to call the shots as it saw them. Thank you.